There is no authority who has the right or the necessary insight to make these judgments.
In all candor, I would tell you it's outrageous filth. If I could find some way constitutionally to do away with it, I would.
Had it with these monkey-fighting snakes on this Monday to Friday plane.
Cruise down a European highway on a sunny Saturday, and you'll find a few things that are considered quite curious to the average American. That song you have blasting on the radio? Yeah, that's the original version with all of the colorful language and cursing that the artist originally intended, not the radio version broadcast in the United States. That box truck that you just passed? No, you didn't imagine it. That's a naked woman coyly smiling in a bathroom advertisement. And the public lake you just drove past, yeah, that's an entire family, from tiny tots all the way down to senior citizens, sun tanning in the nude. But don't let this drive fool you. Just because many Europeans might be more liberating with their bathing rituals doesn't mean that they aren't serious about censorship in other areas. From film to fiction, online to in person, why is censorship so different from the US to Europe? Well, the answer is a fascinating look into not only what we censor, but why we do it in the first place. So, let's take a look.
It is my opinion, without any reasonable doubt, and without any reservation, that comic books are an important contributing factor in many cases of juvenile delinquency.
So the natural first thing to ask is, what exactly is censorship anyway? Well, it's the suppression of words, images, or ideas that are offensive. And it happens when some people succeed in imposing their personal, political, or moral values onto others. In fact, the very word censor is derived from the Latin verb censere, which means to evaluate, to examine, to check. And in the Roman Empire, censors were officials who were appointed for a limited time period and who adjudicated on public morality, besides estimating the value of property. Now, certainly a lot has changed since ancient Rome, but the thing is, even modern humans, with our culture, we still have been pretty deeply ambivalent with the issues that surround censorship in the first place. Throughout history and throughout the world, censorship has occurred in every area of artistic expression, and many of these earlier banned works are considered milestones of art today. In sculpture and painting, a lot of objections actually came up because of nudity. In fact, two of the most famous examples are the Venus de Milo, which was condemned for nudity in Mannheim in 1853, and Michelangelo's David in 1501. In fact, in writing, Shakespearean plays have been censored more often than any of those in the rest of the English language, except for Chaucer. And in the music scene, in 1965, Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones was banned by many radio stations. And in '68, more stations banned Unknown Soldier by The Doors because of its anti-war message. Even songs by the Beatles, yes, the Beatles, were banned by the BBC when Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and A Day in the Life were forbidden for promoting drug use. Yeah, that's right, even Sgt. Pepper himself wasn't safe from censorship. But outside of media, if we take a look at government censorship, well, there's historical examples there on both sides of the pond as well. In France during the First World War, the freedom of the press was actually suspended by a decree and lasted until 1919. And in Germany, to prevent extremists on the left and the right from destroying the political order of the Weimar Republic, the Republikschutzgesetze, or laws for the protection of the Republic, were passed in 1922 and 1930 that essentially gave the authorities the right to suppress newspapers if they expressed contempt for the existing state structure, the national flag, or members of the government, or if they advocated for violence. In fact, in Prussia alone, 284 newspapers were suppressed in the course of just 1 year. But in the US, there are also examples from the distant past, such as the 1873 Comstock Law, or the not-so-distant past with the 1996 Communications Decency Act. But these laws surrounding censorship are something that I personally find just so fascinating, because I really feel that whether you're in North America or in Europe, The freedom of expression really is just such a cornerstone of what it means to be part of a Western democracy. Again, whether that's being buttressed by the First Amendment or in the various constitutions that exist here within the European Union. But that doesn't mean that we don't still try to weaponize and control access to audiovisual content and stifle free speech, even today. Censorship isn't a simple matter, and it's a fact that can be seen in debates about the protection of the innocence of children, for example, and the tension between free speech on the one hand and people's rights to respect and tolerate each other on the other. And I think really, censorship is so much more nuanced than simply a battle between the freedom of expression and the control of others. There's a heck of a lot of gray period that happens in the middle, and while I certainly do not want to get ahead of myself, because there's actually an entire section of this video that I'm going to devote to social media censorship and international regulation, but it's really worth mentioning that censorship, especially online, is something that I actually deal with every single day when I'm working to create content here on YouTube. Part of my research for topics just like this one involves reading news articles that are published in the United States. But because I live in Germany, many of those local news agencies don't make their content available to me because of the privacy rights that we have here in the European Union, such as the GDPR and whatnot. But thanks to today's sponsor, NordVPN, I actually do have access to all of those articles, which allows me to create content that is not only more accurate, but also more inclusive. Whenever I come across one of these blockers, I can easily use the NordVPN extension in my browser to change the location of my IP address and read the article or report while still keeping my browser safe from cybersecurity threats. Their product makes surfing the internet safer and simpler, which is something that I think all of us can enjoy. So guys, be sure to check out the link down below in the description, NordVPN/type Ashton, to get 4 months extra on a 2-year plan. It's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can give it a try and see the results for yourself with no strings attached. Censorship is real and something that you and I probably come into contact with daily, but it's also a constant balancing act, even in democratic societies, that takes into consideration the avoidance of harm and the protection of both the individual and the collective rights. So let's take a look at how censorship plays out in 3 different arenas.
What am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to take over every school board in the country?
You know, nudity in art and entertainment is probably the most frequented target of censorship crusades. And perhaps the best, most enduring example of this is a statue that continues to inspire the masses while also towing the line of public decency even today. And that's the statue David by Michelangelo. When the 5.17 meter tall David was installed in the Piazza della Signoria in Florence in 1504, authorities immediately placed a garland made of 28 copper leaves around his waist in order to cover his nakedness. Fast forward to 1857, there was actually a fig leaf created out of plaster of Michelangelo's David, given to Queen Victoria by the Grand Duke of Tuscany. The Queen was quite scandalized by the plastered David, and the fig leaf was kept at the ready at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, just in case she ever visited and they could give good old Dave a bit of modesty. But David's scandal wasn't just left in antiquity. Most recently, in March of this year, a Florida principal was fired over 6th grade students seeing images of Michelangelo's David in an art class. But really guys, you know, censorship on moral grounds isn't just something that's limited to art and sculpture. Hundreds of works of literature, from Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings to John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, have been banned from public schools in both the US and in Europe based on their sexual content. But you know, if we're really going to explore an international comparison here, I do think that the United States is probably the most speech protective country in the world. But when it comes to sexual expression, well, that in particular is really treated kind of like a second-class citizen. no causal link between exposure to sexually explicit material and antisocial or violent behavior has ever been scientifically established, in spite of many efforts to do so. Rather, the Supreme Court has allowed censorship of sexual speech on moral grounds, a remnant perhaps of our nation's Puritan heritage. But this doesn't mean that all sexual expression can be censored, however. Only a narrow range of obscene material can be suppressed. In fact, a term like pornography doesn't actually have a legal meaning in the United States. Perhaps Justice John Marshall Harlan's line, quote, "One man's vulgarity is another's lyric," sums up the impossibility of developing a definition of obscenity that isn't hopelessly vague and inherently subjective. Okay, now for sure, Europe is not a monolith, but I still would say that it's pretty applicable to state that Europeans tend to have a lot more openness and acceptance surrounding nudity, particular functional nudity in lieu of sexual nudity, because these are actually two very different things for the most part in European culture. Functional nudity is being naked or seen naked in locations where it is normal to be naked. This can be in and around the shower. It's normal to be naked, or at home, or in a public pool, or in a sports club. Obviously, you cannot shower with clothing on. This also includes changing clothes on the beach. Or in the case of our home city of Freiburg, stripping your kids naked and letting them splash in the local Dreisam River that runs through the middle of the city in a hot summer day. Or, for example, just being naked in the sauna. And children here are raised with this mentality. They shower alone or together with family members. And friends, even in high school here in Germany, for example, will go visit the thermal baths naked together. But again, this isn't seen as something that is inherently sexual. Again, this is functional nudity, and this actually translates over to media as well. On television and in advertisements, functional nudity is seen in the same way. You're probably not going to see these scenes censored or blurred, at least not to the same extent as you do in the United States.
Super.
Now, today's calls for censorship are not motivated solely by morality and taste, but also by the widespread belief that exposure to certain images, particularly of violence, causes people to act in destructive ways.
Parents want us to draw the line is with violence in video games.
Now, pro-censorship forces, particularly politicians, like to cite scientific studies that support the notion that exposure to violent images will lead to violent behavior. But you have to navigate a pretty slippery slope if you're trying to find evidence that fictional violence causes otherwise stable people to become violent. And if we suppressed material based on the actions of unstable people, quite frankly, no work of fiction of art would be safe from censorship. In fact, serial killer Ted Bundy collected cheerleading magazines. And the work most often cited by psychopaths as justification for their acts of violence is the Bible. So, for sure, those are the extreme cases. But what about the rest of us? Studies on the relationship between media violence and real violence are the subject of considerable debate. Many correlational studies that seek to explain why some aggressive people have a history of watching a lot of violent TV suffer from the chicken or the egg dilemma. Does violent TV cause such people to behave aggressively? Or do aggressive people simply prefer to watch more violent entertainment? And this push and pull between how we censor violent content really comes to a head when we look at how different nations have chosen to censor video games. In the US, violent content in video games is reflected in ratings by the Entertainment Software Ratings Association, an independent group. The ratings are intended to give consumers information about content and degree of maturity of intended users. However, state and local legislators have seized on these ratings to propose restricting sales to some games to minors. And in general, these efforts have been unsuccessful, but they've often generated years of litigation. But across the pond, it's actually a European nation that takes the award for the first country to ever ban video games. But it actually didn't have anything to do with violence per se. On July 30th, 2002, the Greek government hastily attempted to curtail illegal gambling by introducing Law 3037, banning all electronic games. This, very briefly, led to Greece becoming the first country to ban all video games, including the children's game My Little Pony: Best Friends Ball. Outside of that, probably the first big case that happened here in the EU regarding the censorship of video games was in relation to a game called Carmageddon. In fact, this game was the first to be directly scrutinized by the Italian parliament, who made that every copy was withdrawn to later allow the commercialization of a version which had the pedestrians replaced by zombies who bled green blood. And there's also this widespread myth I found when researching for this that somehow Germany censors video games, but that's a lot more fiction than fact. In 2018, the German courts overruled the so-called Wolfenstein 3D case of 1998, which ruled that games containing symbols of unconstitutional organizations, you know which one I'm talking about, are to be automatically banned and not ever worthy of exemption because video games weren't actually considered a form of art back then. But today, video games actually do carry the same protections as an expressive work of art, just like books or paintings or movies, where you actually might see some of those symbols quite frequently. And in fact, video games were actually never officially censored by the government or illegal at all in Germany. They were just banned from public sale, which meant that store owners couldn't display them on their shelves. They could still sell them if someone directly asked about them. And mail order from places like Austria were actually quite common. The only clear assertion really that we can make about this is that the relationship between nudity and violence and visual content, it's a really complex issue. Violent and sexually explicit art and entertainment have been a staple of human cultures from the beginning of time, and our censorship of that material is continuously evolving. And speaking of continuously evolving, I think the next big arena for censorship, particularly when it comes towards freedom of speech, is actually going to happen in relation to social media. For many users online, social media has become a festering hotbed of hate and misinformation that threatens the very foundations of democracy and civility. But trying to strike a balance between the entire context of freedom and democracy on the one hand and respectfulness and civility on the other is actually a lot easier said than done. The vast majority of Western countries recognize that the right to the freedom of expression is a cornerstone of democracy. We communicate by speaking, writing, dressing, protesting, and in so many other ways. But while free speech is protected by both the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights and the European Convention on Human Rights, these legal instruments offer governments much greater leeway than the First Amendment of the US Constitution when it comes to defining categories, such as hate speech, that can be regulated. Nor does European law provide as robust protection against intermediary liability as Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act does, which shields US online platforms from liability for most user-generated content. In fact, last year, the European Union enacted a new set of regulations known as the Digital Services Act, or the DSA, designed to harmonize content regulations across the EU and create specific processes for online content moderation. And this balancing approach between free speech amongst the European democracies is inherent in the content of the DSA. And really, quite a lot of that law has some really good things about it, and in my opinion are worthy of praise. This includes greater transparency obligations on large social media platforms to lift the veil on their removal decisions and publish annual reports on content moderation and enforcement, I think this is a positive step, that the DSA does not impose general monitoring obligations on social media platforms that could further increase the use of content filtering algorithms to scan, flag, and remove supposedly illegal content. And this is in stark contrast to the US, where platforms enjoy broad immunity from responsibility for content created by users, and where the First Amendment protects against most government restrictions of speech. Speech that can, at times, be incredibly hurtful and hateful. So yeah, on the one hand, this new European law may sound like a godsend to some Americans who have really been worried about the erosion of our democracy, particularly when it comes towards the truthfulness of the information that's being disseminated, especially after the years of cultural upheaval that we've just went through. But when it comes to regulating speech, good intentions don't always result in good outcomes. Because here's the thing, removing illegal content sounds innocent enough, but in reality, it's not. Illegal content is defined very differently across Europe. In France, protesters have been fined for depicting President Macron as Hitler, and illegal hate speech may encompass offensive humor. Austria and Finland criminalize blasphemy, and in Viktor Orban's Hungary, certain forms of LGBTQ propaganda is banned. And the Digital Services Act essentially obliges big tech to act as a privatized censor on behalf of governments. Censors who will enjoy wide discretion under vague and subjective standards. And although European policies don't actually apply in the United States, given the size of the European market and the risk of legal liability, it's going to be tempting and probably financially wise for US-based tech companies to skew their global content moderation policies even more towards a European approach to protect the bottom lines and streamline their global standards. You know, I think the vast majority of us out there would probably like to see social media become a place that is kinder, safer, and full of a bit more factual information. I mean, just especially given the effect that social media can have both on your own mental health, but also just the dissemination of information and sometimes misinformation. But the question of who gets to censor us is really an important one. Is that the responsibility of government or private industry or parents? And who gets to draw the line? Where is that line? I know that these are impossible questions with almost impossible answers, but it's one that I think is just so fascinating and so relevant today. And it's the question that I would actually like to leave for you at the end of this video to let me know down in the comment section below. What are your thoughts on censorship? And if you're here in the European Union, I'd also love to hear your thoughts on this new European law about digital censorship. I think it's wildly fascinating. But as always, guys, if you enjoyed what you saw today, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. And for more content from Type Ashton, hit that subscribe button. So, I'll see you next Sunday. Tschüss!